250cc motorcycle with 6 cylinders, revving to 18,000 RPM. It sounded like nothing else on Earth. In the 1960s, Honda's RC166 dominated Grand Prix racing, redefining what a quarter-litre bike could do. But the same engineering that had made it unstoppable also pushed riders to the brink. Violent power bands, brutal handling, and razor-thin margins for error. This is the story of Honda's GP6, the bike that conquered the grid but nearly broke its riders. In 1964, Honda was facing corporate annihilation, not from bankruptcy or poor sales, but from something far more devastating: outdated technology. The motorcycle racing world had been turned upside down by a single defection. Ernst Degner, an East German engineer, had fled across the Berlin Wall in 1961 carrying the most valuable cargo in motorcycle history: Walter Carden's two-stroke engine secrets. Within months, Suzuki was building two-stroke race bikes that made Honda's sophisticated four-strokes look like museum pieces. The physics were brutal and simple. Think of it like this: a two-stroke engine fires every time the piston goes down. Bang, bang, bang. Honda's four-stroke engines only fired every other time. Bang, pause, bang, pause. It was like trying to win a gunfight when your opponent shoots twice as often as you do. But Soichiro Honda wasn't just any corporate leader facing extinction. This was the man who had built an empire from manufacturing bicycle parts, who had staked his entire company's reputation on a single declaration: Honda would conquer motorcycle racing or die trying. When his engineers presented him with the mathematical reality that two strokes would inevitably dominate racing, Honda's response was characteristically uncompromising. They wouldn't abandon four-stroke technology, they would push it beyond what anyone thought possible. The solution was elegantly insane. If two-stroke engines fired twice as often, Honda's four-strokes would simply spin twice as fast. Instead of the normal 8,000 to 10,000 revolutions per minute that most engines managed, Honda would build engines that screamed to 18,000 RPM, faster than a dentist's drill. The laws of physics suggested this was impossible. Would Honda's engineers prove physics wrong? What happened next in Honda's Hamamatsu research facility plays like a technical thriller, where the heroes are 24-year-old engineers and the villain is the fundamental structure of matter itself. The man put in charge of this impossible mission was Soichiro Irimajiri, Iri-san to his colleagues. He was a brilliant young engineer who understood that conventional thinking had already lost the war. At just 24 years old, he was tasked with creating something that had never existed: a 250cc engine that could match the power of much larger two-strokes while spinning fast enough to tear itself apart. Iri-san's solution was elegant in its madness: more cylinders. Not just one more, but 6 cylinders where 4 had been. Picture a typical car engine. It usually has 4 or 6 cylinders, each about the size of a large coffee mug. Now imagine shrinking those cylinders down to shot glass size, cramming 6 of them into a smaller space than a shoebox, and making them all fire 300 times per second in perfect harmony. That's what Honda built. The mathematics was staggering. Where Honda's existing 4-cylinder 250cc race bike produced 45 horsepower, Iri-san's 6-cylinder monster would generate over 60 horsepower at 18,000 RPM. But power was only part of the equation. The real challenge was building components strong enough to survive forces that would destroy conventional materials. Each piston was smaller than a golf ball but had to withstand pressures that would crush steel. The connecting rods were thinner than pencils but had to transfer explosive force 300 times per second without failure. The crankshaft was a masterpiece of metallurgy. 6 throws perfectly balanced, spinning so fast that a single gram of imbalance would create vibrations violent enough to shake the engine apart. The valve system was pure mechanical poetry. 24 valves, each no larger than a coin, opening and closing 9,000 times per minute. The springs that controlled them were wound from wire so fine it could bend in your hand, yet strong enough to slam valves shut against combustion pressures that would flatten a normal spring instantly. Internal oil passages were machined to tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. Some were so narrow that assembling the engine required specialized tools and surgical precision. A single speck of dirt could block lubrication and destroy the entire engine in seconds. The engineering team worked in obsessive secrecy. Even Honda's own racing department didn't know what was being built. Parts were being manufactured by different suppliers, none of whom understood what they were contributing to. Assembly took place in a locked workshop accessible to only 3 engineers. By early 1964, the prototype was ready. The first time they fired it up, the sound alone told them they had created something unprecedented. It didn't rumble like a normal engine or scream like a two-stroke. It shrieked, a mechanical banshee wail that could be heard across the entire factory complex. They had built a weapon. Now they needed someone brave enough to ride it. The RC165, as Honda designated their secret weapon, wasn't just a motorcycle. The heart of this mechanical monster was 249.4 cubic centimeters of pure 4-stroke fury, divided into 6 individual cylinders arranged in a perfect inline configuration. Each cylinder displaced just 41.6 cc, smaller than most single-cylinder lawnmower engines, but when 6 of them worked in perfect synchronization, spinning at 18,000 RPM, they generated more power per cubic centimeter than any production engine in history. The bore and stroke dimensions tell the story of Honda's engineering philosophy. 41mm bore by 31mm stroke. That ultra-short stroke was the key to survival at stratospheric engine speeds. At 18,000 RPM, each piston was changing direction 600 times per second, accelerating from 0 to maximum velocity and back again in fractions of a millisecond. A longer stroke would have created forces that would tear the connecting rods apart like tissue paper. But the real magic was in the details that couldn't be seen. The crankcase was cast as a single unit with the cylinder block, eliminating potential failure points. Each set of 3 cylinders shared a single head for better sealing under extreme pressures. The valve train used double overhead cams with enough cam lift to move substantial amounts of air, but not so much that valve float would destroy the engine. 6 Kaihin 22mm carburetors fed the beast, each one individually tuned for its specific cylinder. The inner carburetors ran richer fuel mixtures to provide additional cooling for the cylinders that couldn't benefit from direct airflow. Instead of conventional main jets, each carburetor used 5 tiny fuel and air jets. It was a system so complex that tuning required dozens of hours for each setup change. The exhaust system was equally sophisticated. 6 individual header pipes fed into a complex collector that used exhaust pulse tuning to extract maximum power. The system was so precisely engineered that changing the length of a single pipe by even a few millimeters would cost significant horsepower. Despite its complexity, the RC165 was surprisingly compact. The entire engine was no wider than Honda's 4-cylinder, just 14 inches across, and the complete motorcycle was actually narrower than the Yamaha twins it was designed to beat. The finished bike weighed just 260 pounds, less than most modern street bikes with half the power. But all this sophisticated engineering came with a price that went beyond money. The RC165 was temperamental, demanding, and utterly forgiving of mistakes. Oil changes were required after every practice session. Valve adjustments were needed daily. The engine had to be warmed up with surgical precision. Too fast and it would seize, too slow and the oil would break down. Most terrifying of all, the engine could be destroyed in an instant. Flip the throttle too aggressively and the pistons would outrun the fuel mixture, causing a lean burn condition that would melt pistons in seconds. Miss a shift and the over-rev would scatter connecting rods like shrapnel. It was a machine that demanded perfection from both its builders and its riders. Soon they would learn exactly what that perfection would cost. October 1964, Monza, Italy. The Italian Grand Prix was supposed to be another routine victory for Yamaha's dominant 2-stroke twins. Instead, it became the day motorcycle racing changed forever and nearly ended in disaster. Honda had shipped their secret weapon to Italy under maximum security. To conceal its true identity, they entered it as the 3RC164, suggesting it was merely an evolution of their existing 4-cylinder bike. They even went so far as to ship it with only 4 exhaust pipes mounted, hiding the extra 2 until race day. Jim Redman, Honda's lead rider, had been briefed on what he would be racing, but even he wasn't prepared for the reality. The RC165 didn't just start, it exploded into consciousness with a sound unlike anything heard on a racetrack. 6 cylinders screaming in perfect harmony at 18,000 RPM created an acoustic signature that could be heard over every other machine on that grid combined. Rival team managers stood in stunned silence as Redman fired up the Honda for his first practice session. The mechanical shriek was so intense, so otherworldly, that everyone knew immediately what they were witnessing was something revolutionary. This wasn't just another race bike, it was the sound of the future arriving ahead of schedule. When Redman opened the throttle for his first flying lap, the RC165 didn't accelerate, it catapulted. The bike pulled away from Yamaha's fastest 2-strokes as if they were standing still, reaching speeds over 150 miles per hour on Monza's long straights. For the first time since 2-strokes had begun dominating Grand Prix racing, a 4-stroke was simply faster. But Honda's engineers had learned a brutal truth about the difference between laboratory perfection and racing reality. The RC165's compact design, optimized for maximum power, had created thermal management challenges that no amount of testing could predict. At racing speeds, with the engine spinning at maximum RPM for lap after lap, temperatures climbed beyond the cooling system's capacity. Midway through the race, with Redmond leading by a commanding margin, disaster struck. The engine began overheating, forcing Honda to make an agonizing decision: slow down or risk complete engine failure. They chose discretion over destruction, backing off the pace and watching helplessly as Yamaha swept past to claim their first world championship. The defeat was devastating, but it was also instructive. Honda had proven their concept worked. A 250cc four-stroke could outrun the best two-strokes in the world, but they had also learned that raw power meant nothing without reliability. The RC165 was fast enough to dominate, but fragile enough to self-destruct. The engineers returned to Japan with valuable data and a clear mission: build a version that could sustain its performance for an entire race. They had 1 year to solve problems that had taken them months just to identify. The 1965 season would be their chance of redemption. They just needed to find a rider skilled enough and brave enough to master their mechanical hurricane. 1965 brought Honda's refined RC165 and a sobering reality. Building the world's most powerful 250cc race bike was only half the battle. The other half was finding someone capable of controlling it without getting killed in the process. The RC165 was performing exactly as designed, too well. With over 60 horsepower screaming through a 260-pound chassis, it was faster than anything else on the track. It was also more demanding, more unforgiving, and more dangerous than any motorcycle had a right to be. Honda's riders reported handling characteristics that bordered on the supernatural. The bike would be docile and manageable one moment, then transform into an uncontrollable missile the next. The massive surge of power delivered at 15,000 plus RPM created weight transfers so violent they could lift the front wheel without warning. The narrow power band meant riders had to maintain perfect engine speeds or risk losing the power advantage entirely. Even experienced Grand Prix racers struggled to adapt. The RC165 required techniques that hadn't been invented yet. Throttle control so precise it measured in millimeters, shift points timed to fractions of seconds, corner entries calculated with mathematical precision. Despite winning races throughout 1965, Honda couldn't secure the championship. The RC165 was simply too specialized, too demanding for consistent results across an entire season. Different tracks required different setups. Weather changes could make the bike unrideable. Mechanical complexity meant more opportunities for failure. But Honda's engineers weren't discouraged by these challenges. They were energized by them. If their bike was too powerful for current riders to handle, they wouldn't reduce the power. They would find a better rider. That rider was Mike Hailwood. Mike the Bike was already a legend at 26, having won multiple world championships aboard Italian MV Augustus. But Hailwood was restless, looking for new challenges that would push his abilities to their absolute limits. When Honda approached him for 1966, offering him the chance to tame their six-cylinder Screamer, Hailwood saw an opportunity to prove he could master any machine ever built. His first encounter with the RC165 was revelatory and nearly catastrophic. After just one practice session, Hailwood called the Honda mechanics over and began systematically critiquing everything about the motorcycle. The suspension was inadequate, the frame was too flexible, the wheelbase was wrong, even the shock absorbers were unacceptable. According to legend, Hailwood threw them into a nearby pond and demanded they be replaced with British Girlings. But Hailwood didn't just identify problems, he provided solutions. Working directly with Honda's engineers, he redesigned critical aspects of the chassis. The wheelbase was lengthened 3.5 inches for better stability. The frame tubes were upgraded to stiffer materials. Additional cooling systems were added to manage the engine's thermal output. More importantly, Hailwood understood something that previous riders had missed. The RC165 wasn't a motorcycle to be fought, it was a partner to be understood. The key wasn't wrestling the bike into submission, but learning to work within its violent personality. The collaboration between Hailwood and Honda's engineers produced the RC166, a refined version of their six-cylinder that was still brutally powerful, but finally controllable by someone with the skill to unlock its potential. The 1966 season would prove whether their partnership could survive the ultimate test, winning a world championship aboard the most demanding race bike ever built. 1966 was the year Honda's six-cylinder experiment either vindicated itself completely or exploded spectacularly. There would be no middle ground. The RC166 that Mike Hailwood received for the opening round in Barcelona was the culmination of 3 years of relentless development. 61 horsepower at 18,000 RPM, 24 valves opening and closing 300 times per second, oil passages so narrow they could be blocked by a grain of sand. It was the most sophisticated racing motorcycle ever built, and also the most fragile. The Barcelona race proved their partnership was magical. Hailwood didn't just win, he dominated, pulling away from the field with a combination of raw speed and mechanical sympathy that left rivals stunned. The RC166's six-cylinder shriek echoed across the Spanish circuit as Hailwood posted lap times that wouldn't be matched for years, but one race victory proved nothing in Grand Prix racing. Consistency was everything, and the RC166's complexity created countless opportunities for failure. Every race was a calculated gamble. Would the engine survive long enough to take the checkered flag? Hailwood made it look easy. Race after race, he extracted maximum performance from the Honda while managing its temperamental personality. His technique was poetry in motion. Smooth throttle applications that kept the engine in its power band, gear changes timed to avoid over-revs, corner entries calculated to prevent sudden weight transfers. The numbers tell the story of complete domination. 10 races entered, 10 races won. Not close victories scrapped out in the final corners, but commanding performances that left competitors minutes behind. Rival manufacturers watched in horror as Honda's technological superiority rendered their own development programs obsolete. Yamaha was forced to abandon their successful twin-cylinder design and rush a four-cylinder two-stroke into production. Suzuki accelerated their own multi-cylinder projects. Even MV Augusta, the aristocrats of Grand Prix racing, began exploring six-cylinder designs. By mid-season, the championship was already decided. Hailwood had accumulated so many points that mathematical elimination of his rivals became a foregone conclusion. The only suspense remaining was whether he could complete a perfect season. The Japanese Grand Prix at Honda's home circuit of Suzuka provided the perfect finale. Hailwood dominated qualifying, setting pole position with a lap time that defied physics. In the race, he pulled away from the field so decisively that he was nearly a full lap ahead by the finish. The crowd's roar mixed with the RC16's Banshee wail to create a sound that symbolized Honda's complete conquest of Grand Prix racing. 10 starts, 10 victories, 1 world championship. The RC166 had achieved what Honda's engineers promised: absolute domination through technological superiority. But perfection in motorsport is always temporary. Already, the forces that would end Honda's six-cylinder dynasty were gathering momentum. 1967 brought Mike Hailwood his second consecutive world championship aboard the RC166, but also the first signs that Honda's six-cylinder masterpiece was approaching the limits of what was technologically and financially sustainable. The RC16's success had created an arms race that Honda was winning but couldn't afford to continue indefinitely. Every incremental improvement required exponentially more development costs. Revisions that added 2 horsepower might require months of research and hundreds of thousands of dollars in new tooling. More concerning was the human cost. The RC166 demanded so much from its riders that only a select few could master it completely. Hailwood made it look effortless, but lesser riders struggled with the bike's unforgiving nature. Practice sessions became exercises in controlled violence as riders tried to adapt to powerband characteristics that defied conventional motorcycle experience. The six-cylinder's mechanical complexity was also becoming a liability. While Hailwood could win races, Honda's other riders struggled with machines that required perfect preparation and flawless technique. The RC166 wasn't just a motorcycle. It was a precision instrument that demanded surgical skill to operate safely. Honda's engineers were already working on an even more ambitious project, scaling the six-cylinder concept up to 350cc displacement. The RC174 that debuted late in 1967 produced over 70 horsepower at 17,000 RPM, making it one of the most powerful racing motorcycles ever built. Hailwood won the 350cc World Championship on his first attempt, adding another title to Honda's collection. But these victories were becoming Pyrrhic. The cost of developing and maintaining Honda's racing program was astronomical, especially when compared to the relatively simple two-stroke alternatives being developed by rivals. Yamaha could build competitive race bikes for a fraction of Honda's investment. More importantly, Honda's corporate priorities were shifting. Soichiro Honda had achieved his original goal: establishing Japanese motorcycles as world-class products through racing success. The company was ready to focus on production bikes that could capitalize on their racing reputation. In February 1968, Honda made the announcement that shocked the motorsport world. They were withdrawing from Grand Prix racing completely to concentrate resources on Formula One automobile racing. The RC166 and its six-cylinder siblings would be retired at the peak of their success. The 1968 season proceeded without Honda's participation, and motorcycle racing immediately became quieter, less spectacular, and somehow diminished. Today, original RC166s exist only in museums and private collections, mechanical artifacts from an age when racing was driven by curiosity rather than commerce. The few that survive are priceless, not because of their rarity, but because they represent humanity's relentless drive to push beyond accepted limitations. Modern Grand Prix bikes are faster, safer, and more reliable than Honda's 6-cylinder Screamer, but they achieve their performance through electronic sophistication and aerodynamic refinement, not through the raw mechanical artistry that made the RC166 unforgettable. In an era of increasing standardization and cost control, the RC166 stands as proof that extraordinary achievement requires extraordinary commitment. Honda's engineers didn't build a better motorcycle, they built a machine that redefined what motorcycles could become. Would you have been brave enough to twist the throttle on 61 horsepower delivered by 6-cylinders spinning at 18,000 RPM? More importantly, would you have possessed the surgical precision necessary to keep this mechanical hurricane under control? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more stories about motorcycles that refuse to accept the impossible, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell.